All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for a learning and growing webinar, Cultivating LGBTQ plus inclusive learning environments. Our presenter today is Dr. Hannah Ettengoff of Adelphi University, and my name is Ellen, and I am your moderator today for Hawks Learning. We'll have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions into the Q&A as we go. And I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining. I'm just going to share my screen with you now, and I'll talk a little bit about myself, my own work, and then we'll get right to it. So today I'm going to be talking about cultivating LGBTQ inclusive learning environments and what that looks like in dynamic classrooms across disciplines. My profession is that I'm a psychologist. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Adelphi, which is in New York. And my research focuses on intersectional identities, so how multiple identities interact, both in terms of how we perceive ourselves, but also how other people respond to us. And I focus particularly on sexuality, gender, and religion. And I focus on how identities that we may think are incongruent or should be in conflict, how people navigate those tensions. And recently I've expanded my focus to not only be within undergraduate and doctoral classrooms, but also peer education with myself and other training. So we're going to get to it today. So to give you a little bit of context regarding why I think a training like this is important, what we see within LGBTQ youth experiences within educational settings is that there is quite a lot of bullying that still takes place. Sometimes this is not surprising at all to folks, but sometimes people are like, well, I don't understand. Gay marriage is legal now. Everybody knows somebody who is LGBTQ plus. Why would there still be bullying? But what we know based on the reported rates is that it really is still present. It is at greater rates among middle school students, probably because bullying in general is higher at middle school, slightly lower for high school students. But what you can see is that 65% of middle school students who are LGBTQ are reporting having experienced bullying. And 49% of high school students are reporting that. What we also see is that there is a difference between sexual identity bullying and transgender and non-binary bullying. And so what we know is that while the rates for LGBTQ, like the sexual identity bullying, is somewhat lower at 45%, you are seeing 61% for our trans students. So bullying is still quite prevalent. I don't think there's a magic bullet that suddenly turns bullying off when people enter our college classrooms. I think it's still very much present. And that's something that we have to navigate as educators. And you might think, okay, well, what's the harm in terms of bullying? But what we know is that there is a direct correlation and relationship between feelings of discrimination and physical and mental health across minority groups, but particularly for LGBTQ students. And the Trevor Project publishes data every year regarding both the bullying and the suicide risk amongst LGBTQ students. They try to look at those intersections. So you see that the purple number in the middle, that 35%, is for LGBTQ students of color. So looking at those layered minority identities. And what you see is that quite a number of them have seriously considered suicide in the past year. And so overall, the overall sample of LGBTQ college students that have considered suicide seriously in the past year is 33%. Once you look at those layered minority identities, like the LGBTQ students of color, it goes up a little bit to 35%. And then once you're looking at the trans students and the non-binary students as their own category, you're at 39%. So the trans and non-binary students are at greater risk. Thankfully, there is a disparity between people who have considered suicide, the suicidal ideation, and people who have attempted suicide. Which are those lower numbers. But what we do know is that even suicidal ideation is traumatic, difficult to navigate. So when we look at the bullying that LGBTQ students have experienced, most likely for many, many years, middle school, high school, college, and then we look at those suicide risks in college, it becomes really important for us to have the skills to manage our classrooms in a way that can be safe and affirming for LGBTQ students. So we're going to move on. So some of the benefits of creating an inclusive classroom and curricula is that inclusive classrooms overarchingly create a less hostile school experience, and they also increase feelings of connectedness to the school community. There's a lot of higher ed research on campus belonging, and it's really hard to feel as though you belong to your campus if you're feeling excluded from the classroom. So inclusive classrooms increase campus belonging, and we know that campus belonging hangs out with lots of other benefits like higher graduation rates, better academic performance, overall better mental health. Other things that come up are that when we create inclusive curriculum, we're not only benefiting our LGBTQ students, we're benefiting all of our students because we're creating an opportunity for them to become familiar, comfortable, possibly an ally for diverse communities. It helps all students develop their empathy skills, their ability to connect with others, their ability to collaborate with diverse groups of peers. And those are skills that you need in the workforce. Those are skills you need in life. And so inclusive curricula are not just about the minority group that you're trying to incorporate and help feel comfortable. It's about the entire college community and the entire classroom. So what are the 5 steps of creating an LGBTQ plus inclusive learning environment? I'm going to introduce each of these and then we'll break them down further. But the first idea is having inclusive language. Classroom management is key, which is not something that very often academics are trained in. Oftentimes, we're trained in our discipline. Many people don't even have any teaching experience until their first tenure track job, although that is shifting a little bit now. But we don't get the same training in classroom management that a high school teacher would receive. And so it becomes really important to create professional development opportunities around those difficult conversations. Creating inclusive curricula, having a diversity mission statement on your syllabus. I will show you some samples. And also how to create an open communication dynamic within your classroom. So in terms of inclusive language, just some basics for those of you who may be new to some of the terms that I've already thrown out. There's gender versus sex, and the two of those are a little bit different. So sex would be that biological, physiological assignment at birth, whereas gender is what we live and we perform. And people can often be assigned one sex at birth, but have a different gender identity. And there are different parts of gender. There's the gender identity and there's the gender expression. And so gender identity is that internal sense of self. Who do I feel I am? Gender expression is how I share that and express that externally with others. And both gender identity and gender expression can differ from that biological, physiological sex. Another term that you might hear your students throwing around is cisgender. Sometimes you might hear folks say to you, well, you don't get it because you're cis. And then you're wondering, all right, what does that mean? But it comes from the Latin referring same side. And it basically means that your gender identity, your gender expression is matched and aligns with your sex. So when you were born, your family perceived you as a young girl, and biologically, physiologically, that's what was represented. And then as you proceeded through your life, you felt comfortable and confident as a woman. And so that would make you cisgender, where the gender and the sex are aligned. This could be a scary chart, but I like sharing it. It's going to be on the webinar website and you could take a look at it later. But basically what I'm going to say is that our terms and how we refer to minority groups has changed over time. And lots of times I find that faculty may not be familiar with the latest terms or the latest inclusive forms of language. And inadvertently, they might make a student feel left out or diminished because terms that were okay 30 years ago may not be okay today. So a good example of that would be if someone says that person is a transgender. That is viewed as an insult. It's viewed as being quite derogatory. So you really want to take out the a transgender or transgendered, and you just want to either talk about trans or transgender. What I'm going to say about the current terms is that these are the current terms as of today, but they may not be the most inclusive terms in a month or in 2 months or in 3 months. You really do need to stay active and an ally within the community to really get all of those updates. But what I do find is that students are very responsive to genuine care. So if I make a mistake along the way, and I certainly have, even though this is my field, sometimes you have a moment or two where you're distracted, you're processing what you're saying next in the lecture, and then you're distracted regarding someone's gender. Whatever it is, I have found that students are very responsive to genuine care and an upfront apology. I'm really sorry. I didn't process the language I was supposed to be using at that moment, and I will do better in the future. And I find that students at that point do feel cared. They do feel like an effort was made to be inclusive. So I don't think it's really about being perfect and being anxious that you're imperfect. I think it's more about being able to communicate an effortful, intentional attitude towards inclusivity. So one of the things that I like having people do when I have more of an interactive discussion-based longer training session is I like to open up the floor to people to reflect on their gender identities. And I find that the more self-aware you are of your own gender identity journey, the more receptive you could be to that of others. Very often, if you identify with the sex of your birth, you don't often conscientiously break down why that is or what gender messaging you've received over your lifetime. I find that women do so more often than men, in part because there's more discrimination towards women than men, right? If you're a female engineer or a female chemist, but honestly, I would say any woman in an academia is still encountering bias, right? Whether they're told to not have a baby before they get tenure, or whether someone reassigns their lab while they're on maternity leave without asking. There are lots and lots of overt aggressions and microaggressions that women and female academics face on a daily basis. And so because of that, a lot of this reflection has happened in some form. But I find that when I do this training with men who were born with a male sex and they continue to identify as men, very often they haven't sat down and thought about what those gender expectations were that they navigated. And when people do begin to reflect on that, I think it could also be very healing, right? So why was it when my mom went to the grocery store, I was told I had to be the man of the house, even though I was the youngest instead of the oldest? What type of pressure does that convey? How does that play out in my gender norms and my marriage today? And all of those reflection points help people become more self-aware. And by being more self-aware, it opens up opportunities to be more empathic towards others who may have different experiences than yours, but may also go back to this idea of cultural messaging regarding gender and gender expectations. So this is more of a reflection exercise that you could do on your own. The other topic that I want to talk about today is sexual identity. So gender identity is more about, do I identify as male, female, queer, trans man, trans woman? That's the gender piece. And then you have the sexual identity piece, which is related to the gender of the person who you're attracted to, and even sometimes being unattracted to anybody, like with our ace or asexual community. And what we have in terms of sexual identity are a number of different categories that are worth discussing and delving into. So there's that orientation versus identity. Orientation meaning who I'm sexually attracted to, and identity meaning how do I represent myself to the world, to myself? Is this an identity that I own? And what I will say is that in communities that have more negative attitudes towards same-sex attraction and same-sex relationships, very often I interact with individuals who are very confident in their orientation, but less confident in their identity. So the two are not always aligned. And you see that often with the Mormon community, the LDS community. So they'll say that they're same-sex attracted, but they won't use the term gay. And I think that originally within the psychology field, there was a big push to have everyone be out and proud and to have everyone own their identity. And there was this model of sexual identity development that basically said that until you're out and proud and fully integrated, you weren't really fully gay. And that was our model for a really long time. But recently, LGBTQ plus psychologists have found, I would say, more diverse spaces where we're working with populations that have very strong cultural narratives, and you could have and hold multiple identities. And so with my work with the LGBTQ Muslim community, I've certainly seen that there can be complex relationships between orientation and identity. And the field has really shifted where we're now accepting people where they're at. The narrative has changed also in terms of asking people to come out. And we've now started using the language of coming in, right? Where someone is inviting you into their personal space, into their personal experience, versus demanding that people come out to everybody. And I also think that's important for our LGBTQ plus faculty who may be on more hostile campuses, or they may be in states like the Don't Say Gay state. And I think sometimes in those settings, students could be very demanding, and they could say, well, you need to come out, you need to be our leader. And I think that there's a lot more room now within the field of psychology and psychological development to recognize that putting pressure on people and students to come out can actually be quite detrimental. And I think that applies to faculty as well. People need to work within their own pace, and the model of coming in versus coming out, I think, is a lot more individually centered. We also talk about those tensions between identity integration and identity conflict. So sometimes we have students who feel tensions between family values that they've grown up with, religious values that they've grown up with, and how they identify in terms of their sexual identity and their sexual orientation. And again, in psychology, we used to really push to say, okay, you got to resolve those conflicts and you got to become integrated. Everything needs to jive and meld together. And while that can be beneficial, there are other pathways that are also equally beneficial. So I usually don't recommend that faculty take an active role in telling students which direction they should go in. I think these are very nuanced conversations, and mental health professionals who are specifically trained for LGBTQ identities are a better fit. I think in general, faculty's role at this point is to create an inclusive space. I'm here for you. The classroom is a safe space for you. But I think faculty should be cautious about overstepping their boundaries in their training. Something that does come up that should be a part of our training is this idea of multiple minority identity stress, that our students who are holding a gender minority and a sexual minority, right? So they're a lesbian woman or they're a Black queer individual, right? They may be encountering layers of stress, and the culmination of all of those individual stress moments is really greater than the sum of its parts. And at that point, it becomes really important for faculty to take an active role in addressing overt aggressions and microaggressions that may be playing out within the classroom. Obviously, side chatter is hard to control, but sometimes, depending on your field, those conversations may be a part of the curriculum. And being able to sensitively navigate the field is a big part of having those conversations in your curriculum. So some of the ways that we can do this when we see that there's been an aggressive moment or bullying within the classroom is that we recommend that you describe what you saw and you label the behavior. So that would be something like, that word is derogatory and is considered name calling, or it's considered to be offensive. That language is unacceptable, given that we're trying to create a compassionate learning space, something to that effect. So you want to name the behavior, you want to explain why it's not aligned with your values within the classroom. But it becomes really important to continue the education after you have stopped the behavior. But at that point, you have a choice. Do you want to educate the student who has offended, either overtly, covertly, intentionally, or unintentionally? Do you want to address it in the moment in front of everybody, or do you want to do it privately? Personally, I always elect to do it privately. I think that's a better learning moment. People, when they violate a social norm, so when there's a social transgression, it's, we're biologically wired to find that to be very uncomfortable. And it could be a very embarrassing moment. It could also be a moment where you're quite defensive. So actually on day one, when I go through my syllabus, I also talk about, okay, let's try to be intentional. Let's try to be caring and compassionate. This is an inclusive space. Racism, sexism, etc. won't be acceptable within our classroom. And then I'll always say, if there is a moment that's a violating moment and it's something that needs to be addressed, please rest assured that I will continue to have those conversations with the student outside of class. So I let the students know on day one that I respect them, and I respect that it could be embarrassing to make a mistake like that in front of everybody. And so because of that, I compassionately try to address it after class as well. And so that lets students know that I'm aware, I'm not ignoring the problem, I'm addressing it in the best way within the classroom, and then continuing that conversation outside. The other idea is that you don't want to forget the student who has been bullied. So the student who's been referred to in a derogatory manner. You don't want to make assumptions that they're upset, but you don't want to forget them either. So it's important to have a follow-up and a reach out and to just say, hey, how are you doing after today? Anything you want to talk about? And the last part is really about school policy. And I know that in our current environment, school policies are not always aligned with our values in terms of compassionate classrooms. And that puts faculty in a really tough spot. So I always encourage faculty to think about how they can work with administration, the other support centers on campus, maybe even the counseling center, to get some sort of structure in place, some sort of policy in place. If the school is not feeling great about having that policy be specifically to protect LGBTQ students, maybe just having a larger policy regarding bullying and discrimination on campus at large. So if you don't have the policies, it's really hard to move forward within your classroom in a way where students are going to respect you, because students are very aware that there is a hierarchy. And if you don't have the backing of your chair, students will know, and that puts you in a more difficult position, especially if you're an adjunct or lecturer, pre-tenured. So I actively encourage you to reach out to multiple resources on campus to see what type of policies they do have and which ones you could integrate into your syllabus so that some sort of coherence is presented to the students. The other idea is to develop inclusive curricula, and you could do that by having more LGBTQ readings in your syllabus. When you're creating exams and problem sets, you could be more conscious regarding the names and the gender and the relationships that are being presented. And then also making sure that LGBTQ theorists and key figures are being acknowledged within your field. And you might say, well, I'm not in interdisciplinary studies, or I'm not in psychology, so what theorists are you talking about? And what I will say is that LGBTQ individuals have been, excellent contributors to a variety of fields, including those in STEM, and their stories and their narratives of their persistence and their resilience can be very empowering. And I think a big part of students feeling included is when students feel seen. And so making a conscious effort to integrate more diverse reference points within your curricula can be really powerful to students. Where we have 5 steps, so we're on step 4. We also have diversity mission statements, which have become more and more popular to include in your syllabus. Again, very often campuses have diversity mission statements that they want you to include, but those are usually broader about the campus at large versus particular classroom dynamics. And so it becomes really important to help students feel as though they know what to expect down the road. And so here are 2 examples of a diversity mission statement where you're affirming your commitment to diversity, and then you're breaking down how you will help that unfold within your classroom. So the first paragraph is more general. Usually campuses have something like that they would want you to include. And the second paragraph is much more specific regarding gender pronouns. But I think having something in general versus just like a link to the campus's diversity statement can make a really big impact. And then the last of the 5 steps is about initiating open communication. I like to do this on day 1. Again, I find that the very first day is that day where we get to reach students and establish expectations, and then have greater transparency and mutual respect throughout the semester. So when I'm teaching particularly challenging topics, so I have taught diversity courses, I always have a much more comprehensive assessment regarding what their course expectations are, how they think it will play out. But even if you're teaching an intro course like general psychology, I like to have an opportunity for students to reach out and let me know if there's anything that they want me to be aware of in terms of their identity, background, or needs. And that helps students feel seen, all students. It's not a question that I only send out to students from minoritized groups. It's a question for all of my students. It's not one that I would ask at the front of the room and expect people to raise their hand and disclose, because that could be really intimidating in a large introductory class of 50 to 250 students. But it's one that I like to post on like their online learning platform so they could see that it's there and they have an opportunity to interact with me about that. So those are the big 5. And at the end of the semester, I also like to have a follow-up survey. And this is different than the campus teaching ratings. I also like to do a survey in the middle of the semester, just constantly keeping those lines of communication open, also giving them the opportunity for anonymous feedback, because sometimes students feel like faculty have the power. If I tell them I felt uncomfortable by that comment, then I'll be docked for my grade. And so it creates a more comfortable environment for students to share their needs when some of these surveys could be anonymous. All right, so I'm going to open it up to any questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And thank you for joining me today.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ettengoff. Let's see if we have some questions. There's none open currently. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Ettengoff at this time?
Feel free to put them in the chat.
Yes, please do. If not, Dr. Ettingolf, I do have a question. How can educators navigate potential resistance or pushback from students when implementing LGBTQ plus inclusive practices in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think some of the pushback that I've encountered from students has been related to perceptions regarding agendas or political agendas. And so I find that starting on the first day with contextualizing my stance outside of political context becomes really important because these issues are very charged politically. Students come from a variety of diverse homes. I actually teach on a campus where, in terms of zip codes, most of my students are Republicans. They come from Republican homes. And so a lot of these ideas might feel uncomfortable to them in some way. And so what I like to do is I like to talk about the value of people and relationships and compassion, right? Because people are not politics, and creating a classroom where everyone feels safe and everyone could learn is a universal value. So that's sort of step one, where I try to talk about it in very human and relational terms. But step two is that I also like to situate these things outside of myself. So I say, I'm passionate about it. This is what I do. I'm an LGBTQ plus researcher. This has been my career for 20 years, but this is not my personal soapbox only. There's a larger field. You could get a PhD in LGBTQ studies. You could get a PhD in diversity in education. You could get a PhD in feminist psychology. And so I have found that when I consciously frame the conversation in those terms, students are more receptive. But I find that when I skip the framing, because it makes sense in my mind, like everyone should be nice to everybody, right? That's when the resistance really builds up, because I think the only narrative context that some of the students have when they come in is more political. And, especially with any campus that gets federal funding, faculty are not supposed to be espousing political views or opinions. And students are very aware of that and they're conscious of that. So those are the two ways I try to address that.
Great. Thank you so much. Elizabeth did ask, how do you feel about asking for pronouns at the beginning of the semester? I've had some folks say that they don't feel comfortable sharing them in front of everyone.
Yes, and I happen to agree with that. I'm a member of our Pride Committee on campus, and it's something that we've debated quite a number of times. There was an effort on our campus to have what we would call gender rosters. So at the beginning of the semester, students would be able to log on and they'd be able to say, this is my gender. And then that was like a more private disclosure versus a public disclosure in the classroom. But then we actually encountered a lot of tech difficulties with that students couldn't necessarily log in to change their gender, or if they did, the faculty member wouldn't be identified that the gender pronoun had been changed. So the roster system didn't necessarily work out well, especially since when people are transitioning, they could identify one way on September and a different way in December. And even if you're not transitioning, even if you're queer, gender fluid, it could change a lot. The other thing that actually came up when you have these moments where you go around the classroom and you say, please say your name and whatever you did that was fun over the summer and your gender. What happens is actually, unfortunately, female identifying students felt quite triggered, right? That within an academic environment, they have to say, I'm a woman. And what happens when it's your math class? And there's been so much research about how women underperform in math if they're asked to identify their gender prior. And so what I have found is having that open-ended question that is out. It's an email, it could be an extra credit assignment, where is there anything that you want me to know about you, is really helpful. And then letting students know that I'm open to updates and conversations along the way. Breaking down what office hours are for is also really helpful, because especially with first gen students, a lot of students don't know that an office hour can just be a time to get to know their professor and build a relationship. Sometimes they think they need to have a very specific question. And so creating more opportunities for those open dialogues throughout the semester is really important.
Awesome. And Andrea is asking the change for personal pronoun from preferred pronoun conversation is constantly changing as well. How do we keep up with the current language?
I think it's really hard. It's not like you could sign up for an alert system that's going to send you a notice whenever a term changes. And even when terms change, they're not universally accepted within a community. A really good example of this would be the term queer. So for contemporary LGBTQ youth, they might not even know the history of the term queer. They might not even know that it was ever derogatory. They might not even see it as something that's being newly empowered. And it's just there as a term. It's part of the alphabet soup and the rainbow. And they don't necessarily think about it. But then when I'm working with sexual minority individuals who are older, right, who have lived through times where they were bullied quite aggressively with that term, it could be really triggering for them. And so I think there are generational differences in terms of the terms that we use. So it's not even like everyone within the sexual and gender minoritized community agrees and is on the same page with all these terms. So unfortunately, I don't think there's like one magic way to know all the terms and always be up to date. I think it becomes important to create that sense of openness and compassion. And I find that even when I make a mistake about anything, it could be sexual and gender related, or it could also just be that I'm mispronouncing someone's name because I'm not familiar with that language. I find that students are gracious when they see me as someone who genuinely cares. And so that's something that I need to consciously remember to communicate the same time that I'm telling them, okay, assignments are due at midnight, not 12:01, and you need to come on time, and this is our attendance policy. And as I'm sorting through all those logistics, which is quite a task within and of itself, I also have to create a designated moment within that very first day or the very first week of class to also consciously communicate my openness. And something that I also do a lot is that I let them know that I have grace for them. So if you have to take care of someone in your life, whether it's your cat, your dog, your grandma, yourself, right? I understand, and there's a grace. And then I ask them to extend that same grace to me, so that if I make a mistake, I assure them that it was inadvertent, and that I ask them to reach out and let me know how I could correct it. So I think part of that is really about the intentionality of the moment, but it is very hard to stay up to date. I agree.
Okay. And how do you navigate uninclusive, previously completed research when discussing a topic? How do you take what was not set up to be uninclusive to make it more inclusive?
Great question. Hard to answer that like on one foot if I don't know the larger field that the participant is referring to now. But what I will say is that to me, that's what makes teaching exciting, is that we get to look back at things through a critical lens. I do this all the time when we talk about Freud and his work, and his work on female hysteria and penis envy and all sorts of things. And I say, like, I can't imagine that this theory would have been created outside of the context within which he lives, right? He lives in a very particular context where if women wanted the rights of men, that wasn't a social desire, that wasn't a desire for equality or respect. For him, that was a desire based on women feeling inadequate. And it wasn't about them feeling inadequate about social realities, but it was about feeling inadequate physically. And so we break down, what time did Freud live in? What was the impact of the Victorian era? What was the larger messaging regarding women within his religious context? How did that play out in Vienna? And to me, that's what makes it really exciting. And it's a nuanced conversation because we're not throwing Freud out. He contributed to lots of psychology today. The unconscious, that's that which we don't see but is still visible as a motivating factor of behavior. And so it's not necessarily about throwing out research as much as it is about contextualizing the limitations through a historical lens. So to me, that's actually the most exciting part of teaching. It's a key focus of the conversation.
Okay, and our next question is, how can one deal with parents who are unsupportive of the student?
Complicated, especially since students are, in college, they're legally protected. They're 18. You can't interact with their family unless there's a lot of disclosure forms that are being signed. There's a lot of federal legislation around that. So you certainly can't seek out someone's parents, even if you're friends with them within the community. Certainly not your place to disclose for a student who has disclosed to you. I think that referrals are always really helpful. So referrals to the campus counseling center, their mental health center, that is really key. In moments where you think that there has been a severe decline with the students, so you're watching them miss benchmarks that are really important. They haven't showed up to class in 2 weeks. They're not answering emails. You've reached out to their advisor can't reach them by phone. Then you see them once on campus, but they look sort of disheveled. It doesn't look like they've showered, right? You're seeing some real decompensation there. At that point, it becomes really important to document and reach out to the counseling center and the advisor, making sure that it's in written form about your concerns and what you've seen, and then moving that up the chain. But even if you are a psychologist, I always say it's really important to differentiate your role with the students. So your role as a faculty member is not to provide counseling and support. And even if you did have the clinical training, it still wouldn't be an appropriate manifestation within that context, within that role. And in terms of, if you were a clinician, your malpractice insurance wouldn't cover you within that capacity because you're not their assigned clinician. So I always think it's important to be compassionate, but also important to be transparent regarding what the limitations are of your role, and to make sure that they have someone who's qualified and designated to support them through a difficult time.
Okay, next question I have. What do you do when a student makes known their preferences for name or pronouns, but all the students go by their registered name or their birth pronouns?
So it's complicated. Unless the student tells you and explicitly tells you, I want you to let all the other students in the classroom know, I wouldn't say it's your job to let everybody know and make an announcement and have some sort of policing, unless the student explicitly says, I want you to make that announcement on my behalf. Otherwise, I find that just modeling can be really helpful, so that when you're talking to the student, you're using the terms and the pronouns that they have asked you to use. Then other students hear that and they make those adjustments as well. If at any point you're in doubt, you could also reach out to the student. You could say, hey, I know this is what you've asked me to do. I've made an effort to do that. I noticed that other students aren't doing that. How would you like that to be addressed, if at all? Because you'd be surprised. Not everybody wants that to be explicitly addressed. And so sometimes, we could think that we're somebody's champion, and really we've disempowered them at the moment by taking away that choice. So it's really important to ensure that the LGBTQ students feel empowered to make their own choices regarding how they want those moments to be navigated.
Okay, and it looks like there is a comment that they like Tanya says that her LMS allows faculty and students to put pronouns if they like, however, if not, just the name appears. There is a lot of appreciation for your updates to the terms. And Sharon asks if your PowerPoints particularly your list of the updated terms could be available to the participants. So, Dr. Ettengoff, would you be interested in providing us with the PowerPoint so we could share that as well as the recording of this webinar?
Sure, I could send that list via email. So just reach out to me and I'll send you the list. And then the whole recording is going to be on the webinar website too.
Okay. Okay, great. I is there John says, sorry, I meant if they'd known on day one of their preferences, yet every time the students refer to them, they don't use those.
So again, I would go back to the student who identified their preferences in public in class and said, this is, I want to be called they, but students are not using the term they. I think at that point, go back to the original student who identified a need and say, I know you identified that need, I'm respecting that need, but I also see that students are not replicating the modeling that I'm doing. Is there something specifically that you would like me to do in order to address that? And it's not so much about passing the buck or deferring a difficult situation. It's really about creating an opportunity for someone to feel agentive about what is very personal. It's their identity. So, it's really important to give them that space to navigate their identity experience with support, with compassion, but that they're the ones who are driving that discourse.
Okay. And then Andrea asks, what is the history of they?
I think that's bigger than what I could get to today, because you'd really need a course in queer studies for that. I think we've gone through a number of different iterations regarding people who don't necessarily want their gender pronouns to be binary. Binary meaning one or the other, male or female. I know that there was a movement in the 60s of Z. I always really liked the Z. I thought that was awesome because it was like he, she, Z. It sort of like flowed. And it was, it was definitely something I played around with at different points. When I was growing up, I was like, oh, that's so cool. But I think that they comes from, a similar stance where it's, you don't want to have a particularly defined box that you want to fit in, that you want to identify as being beyond the binary. So it's not an either or, a black or white, a she or a he, but that you're moving beyond it, right? So like to me, Z was easy. But to people who want to really break the boundaries, they're like, no, why am I still going with the E at the end? I'm going to change it up. But I also think, again, it's a more comprehensive conversation than one I could have just like right now. But the essence of it is being beyond the binary.
Okay. I do have one additional question for you. In what ways can colleges provide ongoing support and professional development for faculty to ensure they are equipped with the necessary knowledge and skills to create and maintain LGBTQ plus inclusive classrooms?
Great question. I think a lot of this is linked to funding. And a lot of that is linked to politics and the board of trustees. So on campuses that have the funding, the support of the board of trustees or federal or state support, there often is a diversity center, an LGBTQ center, an interfaith center that can offer support and training. And you could reach out, let them know you're interested, ask them to come to training or one of your departmental meetings. And that's one avenue. On campuses where there is more tension regarding LGBTQ inclusivity, I usually recommend reaching out to your counseling center on campus and asking one of the clinicians to come in and do a training because part of their qualifications and part of the association, the American Psychological Association standards are that they're inclusive and that they're aware of LGBTQ issues. So they have to be up to date. And so inviting them in to share their knowledge can be really empowering. If you're on a private campus, a religious campus, you might not actually have a counseling center that is LGBTQ inclusive. In some states, they're still encouraging people to change their sexual identity, right? So then you're in a little bit of a tougher spot in terms of on-campus resources that you could secure. But what I will say is that in my own training work that I've done privately, I've worked with individual chairs and deans on campuses that don't have the resources there, but then they use departmental training funds or departmental professional development funds to bring me in as an external resource. But on more inclusive campuses, a lot of those resources are on campus. You just need to reach out to the right person and then bring them in to your departmental meeting.
And we did have another question come into the chat. Do you think schools should have policies for bathroom usage? He asked this a long while back and was told it was forthcoming, but absolutely nothing has been communicated. In such a case, if a faculty sees something, what are they supposed to do?
So I usually opt with the don't do anything in that scenario because the parameters of my job are not to police campus policies regarding bathrooms. So that's usually my stance in terms of myself. What I will say is that it's really hard to create inclusive bathrooms on campus simply because we're often working within very old buildings, and there are limited lines for plumbing. The existing lines for plumbing are not really working. And I mean, there are all sorts of inequities regarding bathrooms, even when you're working within the binary. I remember when I was pregnant, there was no women's bathroom on my floor. And, I'd have to like wait for a really long elevator or go up a whole bunch of flights. And that was amazingly inconvenient. And I can't even tell you how many times I was like, you know what, if I need to, I'm just using the men's room and everyone's just going to deal with it, because having equitable bathroom spaces on campuses are just really, really challenging. We have a handful, but they're not evenly distributed across all of our buildings. And I know that's the same across campuses. So I generally feel people are going to do what they're going to do. I don't need to be the person who's policing things on campus. I think it becomes an administrative issue. If a student is upset, a student would have to go through campus safety, they'd have to go to administration, etc. But I'm never going to tell someone to get out of the bathroom.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions? I think that was the last one. If not, that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Dr. Ettengoff, and thank you all for attending today. We will be emailing you a link to view the recording of this webinar once it's available. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to link in the chat below. And these are free webinars. They are brought to you by Hawks Learning, which is an innovative educational courseware company. To learn more about our mastery-based course materials and how Hawks can enhance learning outcomes for you and your students, please visit www.hawkslearning.com. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for attending today's webinar.
Thank you. Take care.